All right, so here we go for chapter 9, the general senses. So gosh, we've talked about a lot up until now. We have talked about the nervous system and the overview of the nervous system, the sensory division, the motor division, parts of the sensory division, not all of it, because we're going to get into some more now. Pathways, the two divisions of the motor nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, the somatic and autonomic. We're going to talk about the general senses in this chapter, chapter 9, and the special senses. And the special senses are like sight, smell, hearing, taste. General senses are everything else. So temperature, pain, touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception. And proprioception is basically sensing changes in body movement. So there's proprioceptors in like muscles and joints that could basically sense changes in body position. All of these sensations here, this temperature, pain, touch, pressure, these are stimuli basically, and a stimulus is what will activate a sensory receptor. So a stimulus, like a change in temperature or the feeling of pain. You feel pain because pain, that damage to some tissue or a receptor where that damage is located has been activated to send an action potential but from a sensory receptor along a sensory neuron to the brain to tell you, ouch, that hurt. Or if somebody touches your arm, if you take your pointer finger and touch part of your arm, you can feel that, right? Well, there are sensory receptors where you have touched yourself in your skin that are sending signals to your brain to say you're being touched right there on your arm. Those sensory receptors are specialized cells or processes on cells. Like we've talked about dendrites, right? The simplest example of a sensory neuron or a sensory receptor on a neuron is a dendrite, which is called a free nerve ending. So free nerve ending is the same thing as a dendrite. It's basically got this receptor embedded in its membrane. Remember, a dendrite is the part of a neuron that receives information, and that's receiving information by way of receptors, sensory receptors. And these sensory receptors happen to be embedded in the membrane of this dendrite. A dendrite is an extension of the cell membrane. So those little finger-like extensions from the cell body are just parts of the cell membrane that extend out. And on those extensions, the dendrites, there's sensory receptors. And those sensory receptors respond to different stimuli. And we've got different receptors that respond to temperature, a different receptor that responds to pain, touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception, changes in body movement or body position. But basically, some sensory receptors respond to just one stimulus, like touch or pain. Other receptors, or proprioception, other receptors respond to a couple of those senses or of those stimuli. So some of them can be stimulated by many different stimuli, which means they have little what's called receptor specificity. If a sensory receptor is really specific, it may only be activated by one stimulus, like temperature, for example. But some of these sensory receptors can be basically stimulated or activated by a couple of stimuli, and that would mean they don't have a lot of receptor specificity. So there's a bunch of different stimuli that can activate one receptor. For example, a free nerve ending. So right here's a bunch of dendrites, right? This free nerve ending is the dendrite, where there maybe in the membrane of that dendrite there's a receptor that can be activated by one of the stimuli that we talked about on the previous slide. So that's just one example. This happens to be a free nerve ending in the skin. These are free nerve endings in the skin. Basically, to classify them, we classify these sensory receptors based on the stimulus that activates them or stimulates them. Nociceptors are activated in response to pain. So these are our pain receptors. So when you feel pain, that feeling of pain is being sensed or consciously perceived because nociceptors are activated and have sent sensory information to the brain to say, ouch, that hurts. So these pain receptors, they have a really big, what's called receptive field. And a receptive field is basically like is basically the area that one sensory receptor monitors. So think about a basketball player in a zone defense. That the one defender has an area to monitor. And if any other player comes into his zone, his or her zone, it's that player is their responsibility to guard. So a receptive field is basically one nociceptor, one pain receptor has an area of the body to monitor. And it's a pretty big area compared to other receptors. And there's quite a bit of sensitivity. Thermoreceptors, think thermo is temperature, like a thermometer can measure temperature, changes in temperature. They're located in the dermis, so the layer just underneath the epidermis in the skin, embedded in skeletal muscles, but also in the liver and the hypothalamus. Like the hypothalamus is where your core temperature is located. So there's thermoreceptors located there. And there's way more cold receptors than there are warm receptors. So there's thermoreceptors that respond to cold and thermoreceptors that respond to warm. But if warm tried to stimulate a cold thermoreceptor, it wouldn't do anything because that stimulus isn't specific to it. So remember, receptor specificity, if like a chemical, like something you would smell, like something sweet or like perfume or something, tried to activate a thermoreceptor, it wouldn't respond. It has no way to respond to that. So these receptors are specific to the stimuli, the stimuli that would activate them. Mechanoreceptors are a broad category. So mechanoreceptors, their stimulus is basically, so mechanoreceptors are located embedded in a cell membrane. And they're embedded in the cell membrane. And when the cell membrane changes its shape, it gets pushed or twisted or bent, or any mechanical distortion happens, mechanoreceptors, mechanical distortion, right, are activated. So basically what happens is these receptors are just pulled open or closed when the membrane changes shape, it stretches or compresses or twists. And there's three specific types of mechanoreceptors. One's called a proprioreceptor that monitors position of joints and muscles, so body position. Baroreceptors, think about a barometer, detects changes in atmospheric pressure. Well, you have baroreceptors in your body that detect changes in pressure in like the walls of blood vessels. So in the wall of a blood vessel, when more blood flows through that blood vessel, the walls of the blood vessel stretch. And that activates a baroreceptor to tell your brain, well, blood pressure is increased. And think tactile is touch. Tactile receptors provide information or basically respond to touch, pressure, and vibration. So those are all three specific examples of mechanoreceptors. We're going to talk more about them here shortly. And then chemoreceptors, think chemo is chemical. So chemoreceptors respond to a substance or a chemical that's dissolved in our body fluids. And chemoreceptors you can find in the special senses as well. So we'll talk more about those later. So there's a figure that overviews that. We're not going to spend time on that because that's what we just talked about. And here's an overview of the general sensory receptors that you can find in just the skin. Look at how crazy this is. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different types of general sensory receptors in just your skin. So let's talk about them. One is a free nerve ending. Remember a dendrite we just talked about. There's basically branching tips of these sensory neurons. So the sensory neurons themselves have the sensory receptors located in these neurons on dendrites. And they're not protected by anything. So they're very non-specific. Free nerve endings are really sensitive. And they're not protected. We'll talk about some sensory receptors that are protected by like connective tissues. These are just freely open. So they're tiny little dendrites that are just exposed to the environment around them in your body. That's what makes them really sensitive. They're easily activated because there's nothing to cover them and protect them or keep them from being stimulated. Tactile pain and temperature receptors in the skin are the most common that have at least one type of these tactile pain and temperature receptors are a free nerve ending. But you've got a bunch of different types of tactile receptors in the skin, even in the skin. We'll talk a little bit about those as we go. So there's that figure I showed you earlier of free nerve endings. This is the sensory neuron or nerve, and these are just dendrites. So the free nerve endings are dendrites on a sensory neuron. So the skin has free nerve endings. The skin also has what's called a root hair plexus. Remember we talked about plexuses? These are like interwoven networks of neurons. We talked about the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexus when we talked about the peripheral nervous system and spinal nerves. Basically, the root hair plexus wraps around the root of the hair in your skin. And as the hair moves, so if you've ever been in outside when the breeze hits and you can literally feel your hair moving, basically as the hair gets displaced and it moves, it basically pulls on the follicle and it distorts the membrane of the dendrites that are wrapped around it. Those dendrites wrapped around it make up the root hair plexus, and that just generates action potentials. So right here's the root hair plexus. There's dendrites that wrap around the root of the hair, and as the hair gets displaced, it moves. It basically activates, it pulls on the membrane of those dendrites, and it activates those dendrites to generate action potentials and send sensory information to your brain. There's a couple of different types of tactile receptors in the skin, and there's different types of tactile receptors in the skin because they respond to different types of touch. Very fine, light touch or deep touch, and it depends on where they're located and how sensitive they are. So there's fine touch and pressure receptors. They're called tactile discs. These tactile discs basically have their dendrites. So they're located right here, right at the junction basically of the epidermis and the dermis. So these tactile discs respond to fine touch, just very light, fine touch. By generating action potentials. So they're located right in the actual dermis, not dermis, epidermis. So remember the stratum basale and the stratum spinosum, right? These layers of the epidermis, that's where tactile discs are located. There's something different called a tactile corpuscle, or Meissner's corpuscle. So tactile and Meissner Meissner's corpuscles are the same thing as tactile corpuscles. They also respond to fine touch and pressure, but also low frequency vibration. And you can find them in the eyelids, lips, your fingertips, areas where there's a lot of sensitivity, right? There's a small fibrous capsule around them, so they're not as sensitive as others that don't have a fibrous capsule, but that also anchors them within the layer of the dermis. Okay, so these are not in the epidermis like the tactile discs we just talked about. The tactile corpuscles, so here's the connective tissue layer around them, these Meissner's corpuscles. And these are right at the junction of the epidermis and the dermis as well, but on the dermis side as opposed to the epidermis side. So these are a little bit deeper, and you can find them in a dermal papillae. Right? Remember the dermal papillae we talked about in the integumentary system, what seems like forever ago? So these corpuscles are located in the superficial layer of the dermis, right? Remember the papillary layer. The reticular layer is the deeper layer. The third type, another type of tactile receptor is called a lamellated corpuscle or a Pacinian corpuscle. These are sensitive to deeper pressure, so a little bit less sensitive than like the Meissner's corpuscle we just talked about, or the tactile discs that we talked about in the epidermis. These are deeper, and there's concentric layers of collagen fibers that wrap around them. They're in bone. We talked about lamellae. That bone, kind of cortical bone or compact bone, is an osteon is basically made up of these concentric layers of bone called lamellae. So think concentric layers, these are lamellated corpuscles, and you can find them deeper in the dermis, in mammillary glands and some external genitalia. So these are also touch receptors, tactile receptors, but they're a little bit deeper. So here's in the deeper layer of the dermis, or deeper to Meissner's corpuscles, and look at the lamellated layers of collagen. So this is a pretty thick layer of protective tissue. So there's a dendrite right here in the innermost there. So that would be a free nerve ending if there was nothing covering it. But there's connective tissue and collagen fibers that cover it and protect it and make it a little bit less sensitive. So the deep pressure is needed to actually activate these receptors. The last type of tactile receptor in the skin is called a Ruffini corpuscle, and these are sensitive to pressure and distortion in the deepest layer of the dermis. So this is in the reticular layer. So Meissner's corpuscles and lamellated or Pacinian corpuscles are in the papillary layer of the dermis. These are in the reticular layer, the deeper layer of the dermis. And these are not very sensitive, so there's got to be a pretty decent amount of pressure and membrane distortion to actually activate these receptors. They're surrounded by a thick capsule too, which makes them even less sensitive. So here's the Ruffini's corpuscle way down here. So there's Meissner's corpuscles. There would be tactile discs here. These are also called Merkel discs if you see them in your book written that way. A Pacinian or lamellated corpuscle and Ruffini's corpuscle. So here's the dendrites. Again, there's connective tissue that wraps around them. And right there would be the sensory neurons axon. All right, so baroreceptors. So those are all we just finished talking about tactile receptors. Remember, baroreceptors, like a barometer, is sensitive to changes in pressure. There are stretch receptors, and I have blood pressure written here because we'll talk about specifically a type of pressure that will, type of baroreceptor located that responds to blood pressure. But these are mostly just stretch receptors that respond to changes in pressure, and they're not just located near blood. But they are able to stretch and recoil. Basically, pressure changes cause a stretch and recoil of elastic tissues. And that change in stretch and recoil is what distorts the receptor. Remember, baroreceptors are a type of mechanoreceptor, like the tactile receptors in the skin. So I have this circled here, or this boxed in, because these are the receptors that respond to blood pressure, the carotid sinus and the aortic sinus. These are the locations of baroreceptors that monitor blood pressure. So information sent basically plays a role in regulating heart function and adjusting blood flow to tissues. So these baroreceptors monitor changes in blood pressure, and when blood pressure goes up too high, these receptors send a signal to the brain to say, no, we need to bring blood pressure back down. And then if blood pressure drops too low, that opposite signal heads to the integrating center in the brain, which actually happens to be the medulla oblongata, to help bring blood pressure back up. But there's also baroreceptors in the lungs that monitor how much the lungs are expanding. So think like a big, deep breath of air. When you breathe in, the lungs expand, but there's baroreceptors there to tell your brain basically, no, we don't want to overexpand, but there's a certain amount that we need to expand that basically just controls breathing rate and breathing rhythm. There's also baroreceptors in the colon, so the large intestine, and all along the digestive tract to monitor volume and basically trigger reflexes there that can move things along the digestive tract. And then also the urinary bladder wall. There's mechanoreceptors that are baroreceptors in the wall of the bladder that monitor how full the bladder is and can trigger urination. So think about having to pee really bad and needing to run to the bathroom. When that is being signaled to you, that's coming originally from a sensory receptor, a mechanoreceptor that is a baroreceptor in the wall of the bladder. It's stretching and sending a signal to the brain saying, hey, gotta go. So there's the locations of those receptors. I'm going to keep moving to chemoreceptors. Remember, chemical, they detect changes in concentrations of specific chemicals in the blood. They play a role in reflex, breathing rate and depth of breathing, so respiration and cardiovascular function. So there's three major locations of chemoreceptors. One's, you've got chemoreceptors that basically within the medulla monitor pH and carbon dioxide levels in the cerebrospinal fluid. So up in the medulla oblongata, there's a location that's in the central nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, you have two areas where there were also baroreceptors. You've got chemoreceptors, carotid and aortic bodies in the carotid artery and the aorta, the biggest artery in the body, that also monitor pH and carbon dioxide, but also oxygen levels. And if carbon dioxide becomes too high, like if you're breathing really slowly and you need to breathe more air in, those receptors all respond and say, okay, carbon dioxide is too high or too low, or oxygen is too low, we need to bring it back up. And to do that, basically the medulla communicates in its motor function by way of motor neurons to like the diaphragm to tell you to breathe more or less, or faster or slower. So here's there's a carotid, here's a carotid artery runs up your neck, right? So right there's the aorta. So right there's chemoreceptors of the aorta. Those are aortic bodies. Right here's carotid bodies. So there's the carotid artery. So if you ever take your pulse in your neck, you're taking your pulse from your carotid artery. We'll talk about that guy later. So right there's a bigger version of it. And up here in the medulla, there's chemoreceptors. All right, so I will see you for the next chapter, or the next portion of this chapter, where we're going to talk about special senses. And we'll get into 2 different sections of special senses, because we'll talk mostly about the eye and the ear and a little bit about smell and taste. So I will see you soon.